There is a room somewhere in a museum where the air is always a little cooler than the rest of the building. You walk in and the temperature drops not uncomfortably, just noticeably. The way a stone hallway feels different from a carpeted one. The lights are dim and warm, almost amber, and they fall at a low angle across the display cases. It feels less like a gallery and more like a place where the lights were never quite turned all the way up. Tonight, we're starting with something a little different. You stop in front of one of the cases. Inside it, resting on a small mount, is a tablet. Not a large one. It's smaller than you'd probably expect, maybe the size of a man's open hand. The colour is pale, somewhere between cream and sand, and its edges are slightly irregular, worn just enough that you can tell no machine made it. The surface is covered in marks, small, wedge-shaped impressions pressed into the clay, hundreds of them, arranged in careful rows. They don't look like writing to you. They look more like the tracks a bird might leave across a mudflat. But they are writing, one of the oldest kinds of writing that exists anywhere on Earth. It should have crumbled. The civilization that made it rose and fell in a river delta where nothing was supposed to last: wet soil, seasonal floods, a landscape that swallowed everything in time. Clay, when it's left to the elements, softens and dissolves. It doesn't persist. It doesn't travel across millennia, but it didn't. If this is the calm night you are hoping for, slow, quiet, something to carry you off gently, then you're in the right place. If you haven't already, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you'd think, and it means the next night you're looking for something like this, there'll be more waiting for you. And if you want to leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from tonight, we'd love to know. There's something nice about knowing where people are when they close their eyes. Now, let's begin. The tablet in the case is part of a collection that came out of ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now roughly southern Iraq. The civilization that left these objects behind is called Sumerian, and for a long time the word Sumer meant almost nothing outside of scholarly circles. It was a forgotten place. Its cities had been buried for so long that most of the world didn't know they had ever existed. These tablets came out of that buried world, thousands of them, found in layers of soil and debris, some cracked, some nearly intact, some scorched by fires that had burned through buildings thousands of years ago. And pressed into their surfaces in this wedge-shaped script called cuneiform was a record of things. Lists, transactions, stories, names, and something else. There is a concept written across some of these tablets that scholars translate with a small word, the me. You'd say it's something like may in English, though the pronunciation doesn't matter as much as what it meant. The me, and this is the part that takes a moment to settle, was understood by the ancient Sumerians as a vast cosmic inventory, a list of everything that made civilization possible. Not a wish list, not a prayer, a list of the actual forces and conditions that held the world together and kept it running. Kingship was on the list. So was the descent into the underworld. So was music, and the art of the smith, and the scribal arts, and certain kinds of priestly rites, and the processes of weaving, and of brewing, and of building. Justice was on the list. Falsehood was on the list. Descent and ascent. Power and its limits. Things that seemed like opposites sat next to each other in the inventory because both were real, both were necessary, both were part of the complete picture. The me were not commandments. They weren't laws handed down by a god to govern human behaviour. They were more like a description of reality, as it actually was a record of the invisible architecture that held things in place. And the Sumerians believed that these forces were real, that they existed somewhere between the human and the divine, and that they needed to be tended. Your body might be settling now. If you're lying down, you can let your shoulders drop a little. The story will keep going. There's no need to hold on to any of it too tightly. Just let it pass by. The scribes who kept these records were not high-ranking figures, at least not in the way we usually imagine power. They were trained from childhood, often from families that had been producing scribes for generations, and their work was precise and repetitive and took years to master. You'd sit in a school, the Sumerians called it the Edubba, the tablet house, and you'd copy lines until your hand knew the shapes without thinking. You'd press a reed stylus into a fresh clay surface and drag it in small, deliberate angles, and then you'd press again. The tablets were made of alluvial clay, the same clay that was everywhere along the riverbanks. It was common material, ordinary, the kind of thing you could pick up with your hands and shape in a few minutes. That was part of the problem. Clay that hasn't been fired is fragile. Sun-dried clay holds its shape in dry conditions, but it doesn't like moisture. It doesn't like being buried in damp earth. It has no business surviving the kind of catastrophic collapses that eventually came for these cities. The math, if you tried to work it out, would tell you that almost none of this should have made it, and yet the tablets kept turning up. Excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries pulled them out, tells those low mounds of accumulated debris that dot the flat landscape of southern Iraq, the compressed ruins of cities stacked on top of each other over centuries. The tablets came out of debris layers and storage rooms and what had once been temple archives. Some came out in remarkable condition. Some arrived in pieces that had to be fitted back together, like puzzles in conservation rooms, where people worked with small brushes and steady hands. A scribe working in a city like Nippur or sitting in a room lit by oil lamps, pressing signs into fresh clay that scribe had no reason to believe the tablet would outlast the morning, let alone the civilization. The work was administrative. It was daily. It was the kind of labour that feels unremarkable when you're doing it, because it's just what the day requires. Over time, this became the texture of the world they lived in. The tablets were part of the infrastructure, the way roads are infrastructure, not glamorous, not sacred in themselves, just necessary. They kept track of grain and silver and labour and cattle. They preserved hymns and laments and lists of divine names. And among them, written with the same care and the same modest materials, were the accounts of the me, those invisible forces that the ancient Sumerians believed were the bones beneath everything. The room you're standing in is very quiet. The amber light catches the edge of the tablet at a low angle, and in that light, you can see the depth of each impression more clearly. Each wedge is a small shadow. Each line of text is a row of those shadows. Somebody made each one of them by hand. Somebody's fingers held the stylus. The clay was still soft when they pressed it in. What's easy to forget is that these tablets were not written for us. They were written for their world, in the service of their world. They were never intended to cross thousands of years and end up in a case under warm museum lighting, far from the rivers where the clay was pulled from the ground. The distance between what they were and what they've become is one of the stranger quiet facts about human history. The tablet rests on its mount. The room holds its coolness around it. Somewhere out there, beyond the museum walls and beyond this night, the land where these tablets were made is still there, flat, dry in places, rich with silt, crossed by rivers that have shifted their courses since anyone wrote anything on anything. The cities are gone from the surface. The tablet houses are gone. But the tablets themselves ended up here, in this room, in this light, holding inside them a description of the world as someone once understood it to be. They hold a list of things that should have dissolved back into the mud long before any of us were born. They didn't dissolve. And that, quietly, is where this story begins. The story begins in a place that no longer looks like much. If you were to travel to southern Iraq today and find the low mound of Tel Abu Sharain, you'd stand on a flat, dry rise of earth in a landscape that stretches out in every direction with very little to interrupt it. The ground is pale and cracked in the dry season. The air smells of dust and heat. There are no rivers visible from where you'd stand, no obvious reason why anyone would have looked at this particular spot and decided it was the right place to build something lasting, and yet the Sumerians believed this was where it all began. The city buried under that mound is called Eridu. The name means something close to the good place, or the mighty place, depending on how you read the early texts. The Sumerians held it in a different category from other cities, not just old, but first, the oldest city in their tradition. The place where kingship was said to have descended from the heavens for the first time, before it was carried anywhere else. That's a large claim for a mound of crumbled mud, but if you could stand there 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, the landscape would have told you something different. The Persian Gulf was closer then. The southern marshes stretched further inland. The whole southern end of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley was wetter, more tangled, more alive with reeds and shallow water and the movement of birds. Eridu didn't sit in a desert. It sat near the edge of a world defined by water, fresh water coming down from the rivers, salt water pressing in from the Gulf, and in between, a wide, slow mixing of the two. A place where the land and the water hadn't quite decided where one ended and the other began. There is a sound that belongs to that specific landscape. It's a low, continuous rustling, the sound of wind moving through tall reeds at the edge of a canal. It doesn't stop. It varies slightly, rises and falls, but it never really ends. During the day, it's easy to ignore. At night, when everything else quiets down, it fills the space with something that isn't silence and isn't noise. It's just presence. Water and reed and air. Eridu sat inside that sound. The city's temples were among the oldest structures found in Mesopotamia. Beneath the surface, excavations revealed layer after layer of mud brick buildings, each one built on top of the remains of the one before it, going back to the earliest centuries of settled life in the region. The first temple was almost nothing, a small mud-plastered room with a low altar. By the time the city reached its peak, the structure had grown into something considerably more substantial, built up across generations until it was a proper, elevated platform rising above the surrounding flat. A ziggurat in the making, though that word came later. What remained constant across all those layers of construction was what the building was for. Each version of the temple was associated with the same presence, the same god. The Sumerians called him Enki. The Akkadian name, used later by neighbouring peoples, was Ea. He was one of the oldest figures in the Mesopotamian understanding of the divine. Not a war god, not a storm god, not the kind of deity you prayed to for rain or victory. Enki was the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of craft and intelligence and the careful ordering of things. He was the one who knew how things worked, and more than that, he was the one who held the blueprint. According to the tablets, the Mi lived with Enki. He kept them in his house beneath the water. That house had a name, the Abzu. The Sumerians described it as a sacred reservoir, not a building exactly, but a vast, quiet body of fresh water that existed beneath the surface of the earth, beneath the city, beneath the temples, beneath the visible world. The Abzu was not empty. It was the source of the underground springs that fed the rivers, the origin of the clean water that made life in a dry landscape possible. It was real in the sense that the Sumerians could feel its effects every time they drew from a well or watched a spring surface in unexpected ground. But the Abzu was also something more than water. According to the Sumerian understanding of things, it was a kind of primary place, a location before location, the space where wisdom gathered before it moved into the world. And Enki sat in the middle of it. The image that appears across multiple tablet traditions is quiet and specific. Enki, in his house beneath the water, surrounded by the soft movement of underground streams, with the Mi arrayed around him like objects on a shelf, not doing anything dramatic with them, not wielding them, simply holding them, keeping them in order, making sure they remained intact and accounted for. It's a surprisingly domestic image for a cosmic responsibility. For a while, this seemed to be enough. The Mi existed, they were kept, they were tended, and the world above continued in the pattern they described. Kingship was in the world, music was in the world, the processes of craft and ceremony and governance carried on in the cities that grew along the rivers. The blueprint was holding. The tablets that describe Eridu as the first city, the house at the beginning, were written long after Eridu had already passed its peak. By the time scribes were recording these traditions, other cities had grown larger, more powerful, more central to the political life of the region. Ur had risen, Nippur had become the religious centre. Eridu was already a memory more than a living capital, and yet the scribes kept placing it first. They kept insisting that whatever had started in Sumer had started there, in that low wet place at the edge of the marshes. There is something to that kind of persistence, a civilization deciding, across many generations, that a specific location holds a specific significance, and continuing to say so, even when the evidence of daily life has moved on. It suggests that the idea of Eridu was doing something the fact of Eridu no longer needed to do. The city was a vessel for a claim. The claim was about origins, about where the order of the world came from and who first held it. The answer the tablets kept returning to was, it came from the water. It came from the quiet below the surface. It came from a god who did not conquer or demand or destroy, but who simply knew and kept knowing while everything else changed around him. The specific contents of what Enki held, the individual items that made up the Mi, were not all listed in one single document. The tradition is spread across multiple tablet traditions, multiple versions, multiple cities' worth of scribal work. Some texts give long lists, some give shorter ones. The totals don't always match. Scholars who have worked through the material find that the inventory shifts slightly depending on when and where a particular tablet was written. What that tells you is that the Mi were not a fixed legal code handed down once and never revised. They were more like a living tradition of understanding a set of ideas about what civilization required, written and rewritten over generations as the people writing them changed and as their understanding deepened or shifted. The core held. Kingship was always on the list. So was the scribal art, and music, and descent into the underworld, and the tools of governance. But the edges of the list were slightly different in different hands. Whether the me were originally a concept unique to Eridu, or whether they were a broader Mesopotamian idea that the traditions of Eridu eventually gathered together under one name, is something scholars continue to turn over carefully. The tablets don't give a clean answer. They give a direction toward Enki, toward the Abzu, toward Eridu, but not a clear origin moment. Not a single text that says, here is where this all came from, and this is how it started. That absence is not unusual in ancient material. It is, in fact, one of the things that makes the oldest written traditions feel genuinely old. They don't explain themselves the way a document written for posterity would. They assume the reader already knows the general shape of things, and needs only the specific details filled in. The specific details, in this case, point to a low-built temple near the edge of the marshes, to the smell of reed and river, to the sound of water that never really stopped, and to a god sitting in the cool dark below the surface, with the decrees of civilization resting quietly in the space around him. That image still, unhurried, patient, is one of the oldest pictures of cosmic order that writing has preserved. The contents of those decrees, what they were, and what they said about the way the world was supposed to work, are worth staying with a little longer. The contents of those decrees, as the scribes recorded them, were not organized the way a modern list would be organized. There was no alphabetical order, no hierarchy from most important to least. The items sat together on the tablets, the way things sit together in a room that has been in use for a long time, each one present, each one necessary, none of them announcing itself above the others. What the scribes preserved was something closer to an inventory of existence, a slow accounting of everything that, in the Sumerian understanding, made the world recognizable as a world. The litany, when you read across the tablets that preserve it, is long. Some scholars count more than 100 distinct categories. Others group the items differently and arrive at different numbers. The exact count doesn't matter as much as the feeling of it, the sense that someone sat down a very long time ago and tried to write down everything. Not everything that existed. Everything that needed to exist for civilization to hold together. Kingship was the first. The tablets are consistent on this. Whatever else shifts between versions, kingship always appears near the beginning of the list. The Sumerians understood rulership not as something a man invented or seized, but as something that descended, something that came from outside the human order and had to be received and maintained. The shepherd's crook appears alongside it in some texts, and the crown and the throne, not as symbols of power so much as objects that carried power vessels for a force that was real in their understanding, whether or not any particular king was living up to it. Below kingship, the list moved into the domain of the sacred. The high priesthood was there. So were specific ritual roles, the on, the lagar, the na, different kinds of sacred office with different responsibilities in the life of the temples. Ancient texts suggest these were not simply job titles. They were understood as positions that the me made possible. Without the decree that said the high priesthood existed, the role itself could not be filled. The person wearing the robes was, in some sense, borrowing an office that the decrees had established long before they arrived. Truth was on the list. So was descent into the underworld. The scribes placed them near each other without comment, and that proximity is worth noting. Truth and death, sitting side by side in the inventory, as if both were simply conditions of the world that needed to be acknowledged and accounted for. For a while, reading through the list has the quality of a slow walk through a very old building. You move from room to room, and each one holds something you recognize. The craft decrees come next in many versions. Metalworking, the shaping of copper and bronze, the process of heating ore until it changed form and could be worked into tools and vessels and ornaments. Leatherworking was there, the curing and cutting and stitching of hides into useful things. Weaving was there, the long patient work of feeding thread through a loom until cloth emerged, something that had taken many hours to become something else entirely. These were not romantic inclusions. The scribes were not celebrating craft as an art form. They were noting that civilization required people who knew how to make things from raw material, and that the knowledge required to do this was, in their understanding, not purely human knowledge. It had been decreed. It existed because the me said it should exist, and it was kept in order by the same forces that kept kingship and priesthood in order. Carpentry was on the list. So was the art of the smith and the art of the scribe, which, given that scribes were the ones writing the list, adds a certain quiet self-awareness to the whole exercise. The scribal art was not exempt from the inventory. It was part of it. The act of pressing signs into clay was itself understood as as one of the things that civilization required in order to be civilization. Music was there. The inclusion of music always draws the attention of people who come to these texts for the first time. It sits alongside kingship and priesthood and law, not as entertainment or luxury, but as a decree, a necessary condition of the world as it should be. The ancient texts describe music as a force that moved through people, something that the body received and responded to involuntarily. Grief had its music, celebration had its music. The rites of the temple had specific musical forms that were part of their proper functioning, and all of this, the scribes believed, had been established before any living musician had drawn breath. The descent into the netherworld was on the list. The Sumerians believed in a realm beneath the living world where the dead went, and the traditions around that descent, the preparations, the attitudes, the understanding of what the journey required were, in their view, part of the cosmic order. Not punishment, not reward, simply a condition of existence that needed its proper form, and the me provided that form. In their understanding, even the way a person moved from life to death was governed by a decree. Celebration was there, so was lamentation. Both were included without explanation, as if the scribes understood that a world with only one of them would be incomplete. Meanwhile, the list continued into areas that are harder to translate cleanly into modern categories. There were decrees relating to what scholars sometimes call descent and ascent movements between states, between conditions, between forms of being. There were decrees relating to fire and to the flood. There were things on the list that look, across thousands of years of distance, like they might be describing natural forces, and other things that look like they're describing social institutions, and others still that seem to sit somewhere between the two. That ambiguity is part of what makes the me so interesting to the people who study them. The Sumerians did not appear to draw the same line between the natural and the social that a modern mind tends to draw. Kingship and thunder were not in separate categories for them. The art of the smith and the movement of rivers were part of the same inventory. Everything that was real in the same basic way, and everything real had its decree. The word me itself has resisted a clean translation. Scholars who have worked with the Sumerian language carefully, across decades of comparative work, continue to debate what the word actually means at its root. Some translations lean toward essence. Some suggest divine norms, or divine powers. Some approaches treat the word as nearly untranslatable, in its original sense, pointing at something for which later languages simply don't have a direct equivalent. It was not law in the legal sense. It was not nature in the scientific sense. It occupied a space that the Sumerians had a word for, and that later, no one quite managed to name the same way again. What the tablets do make clear is how the me were described physically in the mythological texts. They were not abstract in those stories. They were handled, they were carried. Enki held them in the abzu, the way a steward holds the keys of a house. They were objects with weight, with presence, with the possibility of being taken and moved and lost. That physicality is significant. The Sumerians were a practical people, comfortable with the material world, experienced in the management of grain and water and labour and livestock. When they described the forces that governed civilization as objects, they were not being naive or primitive. They were applying the same logic that governed everything else in their world. If something was real, it had a form. If it had a form, it could be held. If it could be held, it could also be released or taken. And that, quietly, is where the weight of the list becomes something more than an inventory. The decrees existed. They were held. They were the architecture beneath everything the cities had built. And the cities, for a long time, functioned within that architecture without needing to think about it. The list was in the abzu. The world above reflected it. The arrangement seemed stable and old and fixed enough that no one had reason to expect it to change. But the me were not attached to Eridu by anything permanent. They were objects in a house. Kept, yes. Tended, yes. But holdable, movable, transferable. The city of Eridu was not the only city that wanted them. The city of Uruk was not small. By the time the myth of Inanna and the me was being written down, Uruk was already one of the most significant cities in Mesopotamia, large by any ancient standard, a place where tens of thousands of people lived in proximity to each other, where the temples rose above the surrounding flat, where trade came in from the rivers and the roads and the distant mountains. It was a city that had already, by the evidence of archaeology, developed some of the earliest writing found anywhere. It had the infrastructure of a civilization that expected itself to last. And yet the myth the scribes told about Uruk's greatness was not a myth about conquest. It was not about a king who fought and won. It was about a goddess who travelled by boat through the marshes and came home with the decrees of the world packed into her vessel. The goddess was Inanna. Her name appears across thousands of years of Mesopotamian tradition. She was one of the most widely recognised figures in the whole of the ancient Near East, a presence in texts and temples and hymns from the earliest periods of writing forward. The Akkadians called her Ishtar. The traditions that described her were many and varied, but certain qualities attached to her consistently. She was associated with the evening star, with the borders between states and conditions, with transitions that couldn't be undone. She was, in many ways, a figure who moved across boundaries. The myth that concerns the Me is known to scholars as Inanna and Enki. It was preserved on multiple tablets, found in different locations, and the text has gaps in it, places where the clay is damaged or the signs are worn, where the original meaning doesn't come through clearly. What survives is enough to understand the broad shape of the story, and the broad shape is this. Inanna travelled from Uruk to Eridu, visited Enki in his house beside the Abzu, and returned to Uruk carrying the May. The tablets describe the journey south as a purposeful one. Inanna set out in what the ancient texts call the boat of heaven, not a warship, not a barge loaded with goods for trade, but a vessel associated with celestial authority, the kind of conveyance that in the Sumerian understanding belonged to a figure of significant divine standing. The boat moved through the canal networks that connected the cities of the southern plain, through water that was brown and slow, and smelled of river mud and green growth at the edges. The marsh landscape through which the boat travelled was alive with sound, the low creak of the hull against the water, the dip and pull of oars in a steady rhythm, the thick rustle of reeds pressing in close on both sides of the narrower channels where the water was shallow enough to see the bottom, birds disturbed by the passage, lifting into the air with a sound like cloth being shaken out. And underneath all of it, the moving water itself, patient, continuous, indifferent to what was being carried across it. Meanwhile, in Eridu, the myth describes Enki becoming aware of Inanna's arrival. He instructed that she be received with hospitality. The tablets depict a ritual exchange, a formal meeting, a shared meal, a series of offerings. In the Sumerian understanding of things, hospitality was not casual. It was a structured sequence of gestures that carried obligation on both sides. To receive a guest was to enter a temporary relationship governed by its own rules. What the myth describes next is a gradual transfer. According to the Sumerian tradition, Enki offered the Me to Inanna over the course of the exchange, not all at once, not as a single transaction, but in a sequence that the tablets record with some detail. The Me came out of the Abzu and were presented, item by item, decree by decree. The gifts were real in the story's logic. They were handled, named, acknowledged. The gap in the tablets is significant here. Some of the signs describing specific Me in this section of the myth have not been fully translated. Scholars working on the text note that certain categories in the list are legible: kingship, priesthood, the scribal art, but others remain uncertain, either because the tablets are damaged in those passages or because the signs themselves represent concepts that later traditions didn't preserve clearly enough to identify. The gaps in the translation are, in their own way, part of the record. The tradition was always partly legible and partly obscured. Even for the people who studied it most carefully, some of what the Me contained remained just out of reach. The boat was loaded. The myth describes Inanna at the quay, the decrees arranged in the vessel, the departure northward through the same wetland channels she had come through. The return journey in the myth is longer than the arrival, and more eventful Enki in the story appears to have second thoughts and sends his messenger, Isimud, to retrieve the Me. The tablets describe a series of encounters on the water, messengers sent, exchanges completed, the boat continuing north each time. The myth does not treat this as a conflict in the way a modern story might. It has the quality of a procedural, each encounter resolved according to its own logic, each obstacle addressed and left behind, the boat moving steadily on. The truth is, the myth was never really about a theft. The language of possession and loss appears in the story, but the theological logic beneath it points in a different direction. The Me, in the Sumerian understanding, could not be permanently kept from the world. Their purpose was to be active, to be present in the places where civilization was being lived. A city the size of Uruk, carrying the weight of the culture it had accumulated, needed the decrees to function at the level it was already functioning. The myth, in some sense, was the civilization's explanation for why Uruk was what it was, not because of accident or military success, but because the cosmic blueprint had found its way there. The boat reached Uruk. The myth describes the arrival at the quay with a specificity that feels grounded. The dock, the unloading, the me brought off, the boat, and received at the edge of the city. Inanna announced them. The tablets list them as they came ashore, in sequences that repeat elements from the inventory in Eridu, the same decrees named again, in the context of their new location. Kingship arrived at Uruk. The scribal art arrived. Music arrived. The high priesthood arrived. The descent into the underworld arrived. Each one named, each one acknowledged. Over time, this accounting became the city's foundation story. Not a story of conquest or divine favour in the sense of being chosen above others, but a story of reception of a city that received what civilization required and then organised itself around keeping it. What's easy to forget is that every major city in Mesopotamia had some version of this story. Not the same story, not always involving Inanna or Eridu, but some account of how the things that made their city significant had come to be there, and why that significance was legitimate, and what cosmic arrangement it reflected. The Me gave Uruk a framework for answering those questions, and the scribes who maintained the tradition kept returning to the myth because it kept being useful. It explained the world as it was. It made the current arrangement feel not arbitrary, but grounded in something older and deeper than any individual king's reign. The boat was docked. The city received what it had been given. The Me were now in Uruk, at least in the logic of the myth. And in Uruk, as in Eridu before it, someone had to keep track of them, not in the Abzu now, not in a sacred reservoir beneath the earth, but in the rooms of the temples, in the tablet houses, in the careful, repetitive daily work of the scribes who pressed signs into clay and smoothed the surface and pressed again. That work, the daily maintenance of the tradition that carried the Me forward, was quieter than any voyage, and longer. The daily work of the scribal schools stretched across centuries, not as a single institution, not as one building with one set of teachers, but as a practice that passed from generation to generation through the same basic method. A student sat down, a teacher demonstrated, and the student copied. The clay was always fresh at the start. The signs were always the same. The hand learned through repetition what the mind couldn't hold through reasoning alone. The city most associated with this work, in the period when the tradition of the Me was being most systematically preserved, was Nippur. It sat roughly in the middle of the Mesopotamian plain, between the older southern cities and the newer centres of power that were rising in the north. It wasn't a political capital in the usual sense. It changed hands many times over the centuries, absorbed by one dominant power and then another, administered by whoever held the region at any given time. But through all of those political shifts, Nippur kept its scribal schools. It kept its temple archives. It kept producing tablets. The period scholars call the Old Babylonian era, running roughly through the early 2nd millennium BCE, was the high point of this preservation work. The scribes of that period were not simply keeping records of their own time. They were reaching backward into texts and traditions that were already old when they first encountered them, copying compositions that had been in circulation for generations before any of them were born, organising the inherited knowledge of their civilization into forms that could be taught and transmitted forward. The Me lists were part of that inherited material. Students in the Nippur schools copied them as part of their training, not because the lists were entertaining, and not because any individual student was expected to memorize every decree and hold it in their head. The lists were pedagogical in a specific way. They taught the student how the world was organized. Before you could write properly about kingship, you needed to know that kingship was a real force, with a name and a place in the cosmic inventory. Before you could compose a hymn to a temple, you needed to understand that the priesthood was not a human invention, but a decree that had always existed in the structure of things. The act of copying the list was, in that sense, an act of orientation. The student who worked through the Me was learning to read the world the way a Sumerian reader was supposed to read it, as a system, ordered, accountable, with everything in its proper place. The schoolrooms themselves were modest. The evidence from excavations at Nippur gives a picture of small chambers, low benches, the faint marks of countless hands that had rested on the same surfaces over years of use. The smell of damp clay was probably constant fresh tablets coming in, finished ones drying in whatever light was available, the whole cycle running from morning to the quieter hours of the afternoon, when the light shifted and the work naturally slowed. There would have been the sound of the stylus against the surface, repeated many times, with the small pauses between each impression. Not loud work, not work that announced itself, just the steady sound of knowledge being moved from one generation's hands into the next. A teacher in one of those rooms would have worked from memory as much as from a tablet in front of him. The tradition was carried in the body as well as on the clay. The angle of the wrist, the pressure required to make a clean wedge without dragging, the way to hold the surface steady while the marks were made, these were things that no text explained, because they were things that couldn't be explained in text. They had to be shown, practiced, corrected, shown again. Meanwhile, in the archive chambers adjacent to the schoolrooms, the older tablets rested in their storage. Some were kept in jars. Some were stacked on shelves of mud brick. Some were simply set down in rows on the floor of a storage room and left there, accumulating slowly, until a room that had once held a few dozen tablets held several hundred. The organisation of these collections was not random. Scribes maintained lists of what they held, kept track of which compositions were in which part of the archive, but it was not the kind of systematic organisation that a modern library would recognise. Things were kept because they were valuable, and the value was understood even when the specific purpose of a given tablet was no longer immediately clear. Some of the tablets in those archives were copies of copies. The original composition might have been composed centuries earlier, in a city that no longer existed as a functioning centre, in a dialect that had already shifted significantly from the language being written in the present. The scribes copied anyway. The act of copying was itself an act of preservation. Each new tablet was another generation of the tradition surviving into the next period. The text didn't change significantly in the copying. The signs were the same. The words were the same. What changed was the clay fresh, made from the same alluvial soil that had been producing tablets since the beginning of the tradition, shaped by new hands, dried in a new season's sun. Over time, the archive accumulated not just texts about the me, but the whole surrounding world of Sumerian literary production: hymns, laments, narratives, disputations, instructions. The me lists sat inside a much larger body of material, all of it being maintained and transmitted through the same basic method. Students learned the me alongside creation accounts and royal hymns and wisdom literature, absorbing the full inventory of their civilization's written knowledge as a connected whole rather than as separate subjects. What scholars debate, when they look at this material carefully, is a question that the tablets don't answer directly. The traditions being copied in the old Babylonian period were old. Some of them pointed back to an even earlier Sumerian world, to cities and practices and ways of life that were already historical memory by the time the copying was happening. The question is whether the me lists, as they were being taught in Nippur, still reflected the living understanding of the civilization that was using them, or whether they had already become something more like archives of a past that the scribes revered but no longer fully inhabited. The tablets don't say. They preserve the lists without commentary. A student copied the decrees and moved on to the next text, and the tablet dried and the archive absorbed it, and the process continued. What the tablets do suggest, in their sheer quantity and consistency, is that the tradition mattered enough to maintain across enormous spans of time and through repeated political upheavals. Nippur was sacked more than once. Its ruling authority changed. The language of daily administration shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian over the course of the second millennium, a shift that happened gradually, the way most linguistic changes happen through accumulated daily contact, rather than any single event. And yet the Sumerian scribal tradition continued in the schools. Students who spoke Akkadian at home learned to write Sumerian in the schoolrooms. They copied the me, in a language that was no longer anyone's first language, preserving a tradition that had already become classical before they were born. There is something recognisable in that. The careful maintenance of a body of knowledge that is already old, already slightly distant from the life being lived around it, but understood to be important in a way that resists easy explanation. The scribes who copied the me in Nippur couldn't have pointed to a single practical consequence that would result from their work. The decrees were not being enforced anywhere. No court was applying the list to legal decisions. The me were, by that period, a cultural and cosmological tradition, something maintained because it defined what the civilization was, not because anyone expected to use it the way you use a tool. And so the work continued in the quiet of those rooms. The stylus pressed the clay, the signs appeared. A student's hand grew steadier across months of practice, and then years, until the shapes arrived without hesitation, the way a repeated action always eventually becomes invisible in the body. The finished tablet was set aside to dry. Outside, the sun moved across the flat Mesopotamian sky. The city continued around the schoolrooms, markets and canals, and the ordinary sounds of people going about the day's work. The archive held what it held. The tradition persisted in the way that traditions persist when enough people agree, without needing to say so explicitly, that the persistence is worth the effort. A tablet finished drying takes on a particular quality. The surface that was soft and responsive becomes fixed. What was written into it is no longer adjustable. The words are in the clay now, held there by the changed structure of the material itself. Set it down in a dry place and leave it, and it will hold those words for a very long time. Longer, in some cases, than anyone making it could have imagined possible. The tablet finished drying a long time ago. Somewhere in that slow process, the soft clay becoming firm, the wedge marks settling into permanent form, the decision was made for everyone who came after. Not a conscious decision, not one anyone planned, just the simple chemistry of water leaving damp earth, and the words holding their shape inside it. There are tablets in museum collections now that have been sitting in controlled storage for longer than most countries have existed. They came out of the ground during excavations that began in the 19th century, carried out by people who were, more often than not, working without the knowledge to fully understand what they were finding. Tens of thousands of tablets, hundreds of thousands, if you count the fragments. Pieces of archive that had been buried under the collapsed mud brick of ancient rooms, preserved by the weight of the debris above them, keeping dry through century after century, while the cities that produced them passed entirely out of living memory. Some of those tablets are intact. Clean surfaces, every wedge still readable, the signs as clear as the day they were pressed. Others are broken, a corner missing, a line cracked across the middle, the end of a composition gone somewhere into the ground where it hasn't been found. And some are so damaged that scholars spend years on a single fragment, trying to reconstruct the logic of what's missing from the context of what remains. What was lost in the fragmentation is harder to name than what was saved. Not the words, necessarily. Many of the compositions survived in multiple copies, and where one tablet broke, another often filled the gap. What was lost was the living context, the understanding that existed in the mind of a scribe who had copied the list so many times that the words no longer required thought, who knew not just the signs but the weight of what they meant inside a world that took them seriously. That understanding didn't get pressed into clay. It didn't dry and harden and wait underground. It moved from person to person for as long as the tradition lasted. And then, at some point, it simply stopped moving. The exact moment when the scribal tradition in Nippur finally fell quiet is not recorded anywhere. There was no announcement, no last entry that said, "This is the end of this." The tablets just stop appearing in the archaeological record for that period, the way a voice in a room eventually fades when there's nothing left to say, or when there's no one left who needs to hear it. The city continued in some form. Life of a kind went on around the site, but the schoolrooms that had been producing tablets for centuries eventually stopped producing them, and the tradition they had carried for so long became something else, a source of fragments rather than a living practice. Specific rituals described in the me lists had already been fading long before the tradition itself ended. Some of the ceremonies connected to the decrees, the particular offerings, the seasonal observances, the forms of address that a priest was supposed to use when performing certain functions had likely changed beyond recognition by the time the old Babylonian scribes were copying them. They were preserving the name of the practice, even as the practice itself had evolved into something their Sumerian predecessors wouldn't have recognized. This is how most sacred traditions travel through time. The name persists. The ceremony shifts. The meaning adjusts to fit the world around it. Slowly, quietly, in ways that no one announces. What survived is harder to point at directly, but it survived with a kind of quiet stubbornness that the clay itself seems to embody. The tablets are still here. That is the most obvious form of survival, and also, in some ways, the most extraordinary one. The cities they came from are long gone. The empire that copied them is gone. The language they were written in stopped being anyone's native tongue, roughly 3,000 years ago. And yet the tablets are here, in museums in London and Chicago, and Baghdad and Berlin, in university archives, in storage rooms that maintain specific temperatures to keep the clay from cycling through the small expansions and contractions that would over time break the surfaces. They are being read. They are being translated. New work on them appears regularly, adding small details, refining old interpretations, occasionally overturning something that had been taken for granted for a generation of scholars. The me themselves, as a concept, also survived not as a doctrine that anyone follows now, but as a trace in the historical record of something that mattered enormously to the people who developed it. The idea that civilization is not accidental, that it is held together by a set of forces and forms, and ordered practices that can be named, listed, maintained, lost, and fought over, that idea persists in forms that don't look anything like a cuneiform list, but belong, at least in part, to the same long human project. The museum's still life is worth sitting with for a moment. There is a tablet, somewhere, in a case with controlled lighting and carefully managed humidity, that holds a portion of an old list of decrees. The wedges are still clean. The surface has the slight texture of the alluvial clay it was made from, the same clay that was being shaped along the banks of Mesopotamian rivers when the cities of Sumer were still young. The signs pressed into that surface were made by a hand that has been gone for 4,000 years or more, and the meaning those signs carry, partial, sometimes uncertain, always filtered through the work of modern scholarship, connects, in a long and complicated line, back to a world that understood itself as something structured and intentional, a world that believed the order of things had been decreed and could be tracked and preserved and carried forward. Someone walks past that case, looks in briefly, moves on. The tablet stays. There is something in that exchange, the brief attention and the long stillness, that feels like it belongs to a larger pattern. Civilizations have always produced their blueprints for how things should be organized, their lists of what matters and what should be preserved and what the proper forms of things are. Some of those blueprints were pressed into clay and lasted. Most were written in materials that didn't survive, or passed through mouths that eventually fell silent, or existed only in practices that continued for as long as there were people to continue them and stopped when that continuity was broken. The me are unusual not because they are more important than those other blueprints, but because the clay held them, because the ground was dry enough and the debris was deep enough, and the excavators found them when they did. The people who compiled those lists didn't know they were writing for the future. They were writing for their present, for the students who needed to understand the structure of the world before they could write about it properly, for the archives that would hold the tradition while the political situation around them shifted and changed. They were doing the ordinary work of people who believe that what they are doing matters, and who maintain it the way all maintained things are maintained, through regular attention, through the passing of knowledge from one pair of hands to the next, through the quiet persistence of practice in the face of everything that makes persistence difficult. The ancient scribes of Nippur might have recognized something in our own contemporary tendency to list and categorize and organize the world. The long inventories of knowledge that accumulate in libraries and databases, the arguments about what belongs in them and what should be preserved and what can safely be allowed to fade. The impulse behind all of it is not so different from the impulse that produced the me. The world is complicated. It helps to have a list. It helps to know, or to believe you know, what the proper forms of things are. Much of the sacred blueprint faded into broken lines and scattered memory, but the habit of order remained. And perhaps that is the only kind of history that ever truly survives. Not the specific decrees, not the particular names of things, but the long human practice of deciding what is worth keeping, pressing it carefully into whatever material is available, and setting it down in a dry place in the hope that it will hold. The clay held, and now it is quiet, and the night is long, and somewhere in a museum case, the wedges rest in the old alluvial surface, patient and still, waiting for nothing in particular.